All right, everyone. So we're moving on to a new strand for U.S. history, too. And today we're going to talk about the Muckrackers. And so this is 2.1. This is going to be the first of a couple of lectures with the standard. We're also going to include another one and kind of combine them together because they're so closely related. But today we're going to talk about the Muckrackers and who they were and what they did. So this is the standard. It's the students will use primary and secondary sources to identify and explain the conditions that led to the rise of reform movements such as organized labor, suffrage, and temperance. So we're going to all go over some basics with the lecture, but the standard does say that we're going to use primary and secondary sources. So we're going to have several assignments involving the Muckrackers, in which you'll be reading two Muckracker pieces, so to say. One with The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, and one that is Jacob Riis's How the Other Half Lives. So we'll talk about those a little bit in the lecture, but also we're going to be reading them directly. And so you can see kind of what people are seeing during those time periods and why you can understand why they would be wanting reform and changes as a result of what they're learning about from these authors. Okay, so the assignment or the essential questions is what was the progressive era period, and then who were the progressives and what were some of their goals. And then the last one is what is a muckracker, and what impact did they have on the progressive movement? So keep an ear out for those as I go through the lecture today. So some basic context, like we're still in industrialization. We're still having that kind of movement where we're getting more and more industrialized. The same things we've been talking about with new innovations, immigrants, all these things are still occurring in the same time period. But what today is going to be about is mainly about the focus of the social problems and the response to those social problems as a result of the industrialization itself. And so, industrialization leads to unsafe working conditions for many. It leads to city pollution, crime, corruption in the cities, as we talked about with the last lecture with the corruption in the cities and the political machines. We're also talking about monopolies and how they have this very powerful influence over government and so forth. So a lot of these things are all we're going to talk about today are a lot of in response to those specific issues that are happening in this era. So the progressive era itself, it's a time when many Americans are going to try to improve society, and they also want to make government more honest, they want to make government more efficient and more democratic. Now, it is important to note that the progressive movement and the progressives themselves is not a unified front where they've collectively taken all of these issues and they're fighting for them. It's really more of a different factions within our country that are fighting for these various reforms and changes that they want to see both in business, government, and society as a whole. And you could have certain groups that support one progressive issue, but be very much against another progressive issue. So some of the other things that are going about during this time, women's suffrage, the right to vote, it's something that was extended to universally by 1828 to all white males. It used to be like based off of property ownership, but even if you didn't own property and you were white male, you were allowed to vote in the elections by 1820s. African American men were allowed to vote with the 15th Amendment by 1868. Something of which was limited based off of. It was by law they were allowed to vote, but then there were things that were limiting that voting. But at the same time that African Americans were fighting for the right to vote with the 15th Amendment, so were women. Women were fighting for the right to vote, and so when they weren't given to it, that is going to lead to an expansion of this movement to fight for women's suffrage, fight for the right to vote. Something that we'll talk about in later class periods with changes with the constitutional amendment. Limits child labor, and it wasn't just like everyone would probably assume they want to get rid of child labor because of the horrendous conditions that they're dealing with. But it also is, labor unions are fighting against child labor because that's taking good jobs away from adult working people. And so, it's a little bit of both. And that's something they're going to fight for. Improving working conditions, of course, reducing alcohol abuse, which we talked about was a major, major issue in this country during this era of as we're industrializing. Reducing big businesses and the influence of big businesses in general. That's something they were looking for. Ending government corruption, which was very prevalent in the cities, but also in the state level, where you have state officials that were being bribed by some of these wealthy and powerful businesses to pass laws that were beneficial to them, but not necessarily to the greater good or for the common man, so to say. The roots of this whole movement go back to like the reaction to laissez-faire economics, laissez-faire, whatever you want to pronounce it. That is, really a root of a lot of the issues that do come about that progressives want to change. By the government taking a step back and allowing businesses to do whatever they wanted, it led to them cutting corners on worker safety and other things. And so, as a result, there's going to be some pushback to that, and where the workers are going to start to demand for these changes and reforms, and they demand for government to take a bigger step and involvement to that. Because many of the progressive movements believe that government was the solution to solving many of societal ills. And it's something that still exists into today's society, where we have political parties that look at the government as a way to solve some of the problems that do occur in our society. But they, when you think about like why the government, why do we turn to them? It's the only entity that really could stand up to some of these powerful corporations and big businesses of those eras. If there's something, a company has sold me a product that, was unsafe and everything, there's nothing I could do. I could sue them. But they have so many more resources and money to be able to fight me in court that it's an unfair advantage. But if the government has the resources to be able to do things that will be able to force the businesses to change, much more so than the little guy, So that's why they look towards government as a solvency or solution to many of the issues that they're taking on in this era. They also believe that science and technology were the means to be able to fix the problem. If you identify a problem, use the scientific method to identify the root of that problem and then the solution to fix it. So that's something that they promoted much more so. And technology, as technology continues to improve, can improve a lot of other issues. Yeah, sure, absolutely. How about for the unsanitary conditions in the cities, improving sewer systems, improving engineering of buildings, things like that. Those are solutions that can be found through innovation and technology. And the progressives, the way they think, and they see the world, there's the idea of nature versus nurture, where some people are born, and you say, like, people are born with afflictions. Like, if you're born, with an affliction of alcoholism, then that's the reason why you're alcoholic, right? But then there's the nurture side of it, where people, the progressive, are always lean towards the nurture side. And so if you're an alcoholic, it's not because of your nature, it's because you are in an environment that kind of forces you or puts you into a place where you become an alcoholic and such. We talked about the terrible working conditions and people getting off work and going to the pub and getting liquored up and everything. Those are things that progressives would see and say that, like, we have to change the conditions that want to force people or make people want to drink. If we change those conditions in the environment itself, then we can change the person. So that's something else how they view the world the same way. So that leads us to the muckrakers. And muckrakers are these individuals who are investigative journalists, and they go into the underbelly of society and they investigate some of the issues that are occurring as a result of industrialization and urbanization. And many of them, are going to bring to light and expose some of these for people to be able to read in widely circulated newspapers, magazines, and then, of course, books. And so they're looking for scandals in society and big business. They're looking for scandals and poor social conditions in society. And the term muckraker itself comes from fish farms, where you have these giant tanks of fish where they would feed them and fatten them up so you can, butcher them and eat them and so forth. But the more you feed them, the more they're going to do their business, right? And we talk about poop way too much in this class. But anyway, and so they have people who are, called muckrakers that go into these tanks and they shovel out this muck, this stuff that they leave behind. Because if they don't do it and bring it out and bring it to light and clean up the tanks, then it becomes too toxic for the fish to survive. So these muckrakers, as they are, it's a metaphor, it's an allegory for what these investigative journalists do. They're bringing to light the ills of society so that they can improve society in general, get rid of those issues, and then make the tank clean for all society, so to say, right? These stories that they are exposing is going to lead to the call for reforms by the people. It will lead to creation of new laws. It will lead to a government that becomes more regulatory. And these are things that happen during the progressive era, and it starts with the muckrakers. If you identify what the solution is first, if you don't identify what the solution is, if you don't identify what the problem is, there can't be a solution. And they're the ones who are identifying the problem, right? So one of the individuals and one of the assignments I want you to read into, and hopefully you've already done it if you're going based off of the step-by-steps, but The Jungle, which was written by Upton Sinclair, was a book that was written about the meatpacking industries in Chicago. And he is writing this book as a means to try to get people to really evaluate the poorest conditions in which the workers are working. He spends most of the book talking about, the story of these two immigrants, Polish immigrants who, living this life, and they're going through life as it is, and working in this meatpacking industry. And, he wants you to get sympathy for them. By the end, it's revealed that the two boys are immigrants, are boys, 14-year-old boys, working in these conditions. But what ends up happening more so is that people, as they read through The Jungle, they're appalled by how the working condition is, but they're more appalled by how unsanitary the meatpacking industry is. And in the section of expert I've given you for the assignment, it talks about some of that stuff. And you'll see, after you read it, whoa, that is just nasty. It needs to be changed. And so as a result of The Jungle, you do lead to some direct reforms of the food industry. And so Teddy Roosevelt, who read the book and was just appalled, goes to Congress and he asks for them to create legislation that will fix that. And you see two major acts pass as a result of The Jungle and the things that it exposes as far as unsanitary meat and unsanitary food industry stuff. So the Meat Inspection Act of 1906 and the Pure Food and Drug Act, same year, they both passed as a direct result of the problems that were exposed by Upton Sinclair in The Jungle. And even though he wanted other reforms to help workers, which don't necessarily come, you can't deny the impact of that book, how it changes kind of how people view as far as government's involvement in business. And so this is where you start to see government take a larger step forward in regulating businesses to protect consumers and then workers as well, to some extent as well. So other muckrakers that expose some of the ills of society, Progress and Poverty by Henry George. He talks about the increasing disparity and gap between the wealthy and the poor. And so more people will call for reforms in taxation and how we spend money as a government to somehow redistribute some of that wealth in the form of social programs. Looking Backward by Edward Bellamy is going to talk about how corruption runs rampant in democracies because the power of influence is held in the hands of the very few wealthy over the working poor and middle class. Ida Tarbell, who is another important muckraker. She exposes a lot of the corruption in the Standard Oil Company. That's John D. Rockefeller's company, and how they did about business in terms of muscling out their competition and so forth. So it's a very anti-monopoly piece. Shame of the Cities by Lincoln Steffens is about the corruption in city government. So those political machines that we talked about last time, he's exposing a lot of the corruption that goes on in those political machines and urban machines in the cities. And the last one is How the Other Half Lives by Jacob Riis. And he is going to bring to light more of the poor living conditions, especially in the tenement housing that we talked about in previous lectures. Jacob Riis is going to use his new invention of the flash photography and so forth. He takes his camera into the tenement houses at night, has his flash, which at that time was like exploding gunpowder almost. But, he takes pictures of the terrible conditions, and then he writes a book that it's basically mostly a picture book where he shows these photographs, talks about what happened. These boys living on the stoop here, one of them died last night, or, died a week later or whatever, and the other thing he did was he set up these things called the magic lantern shows. And these were essentially a slideshow of all of his pictures in which you invite the wealthy and affluential people of New York City to kind of show them, like, this is how the other half lives. Like, this happens in your own city. You may live a very wealthy and prosperous life, but just on the other side of town, you have people living in these terrible conditions, and you have the power to do something about it, to give money, to demand changes in the safety and building of tenements and so forth. So that is something that he plays a big role, and he's the other author that I have you go into some depth about and kind of fulfilling our standard of examining primary sources to look at what were people being exposed to for sometimes the very first time, and why do you think it's supposed that would lead to calls for changes and reforms in some of the things that they're talking about. So here's your essential questions. Once again, make sure you get them filled out and use examples from the reading or from the lecture as much as you can. So please submit those on Canvas. And just a quick reminder, and I don't know how many people are actually making to the end of lectures, but October 16th is my deadline for any late work or reassessments. It's been on the Canvas page for a long time, so if you are planning on waiting to the last day of the term, it's going to be too late by then, so make sure you get it done and taken care of, all right? Other than that, everyone take care and stay healthy, and I'll see you later.